king named Abimelech. It comes time and time again when Abram makes a mistake, God says, wait a minute, he believes, I'm crediting righteousness to him for that. See, Abram's superpower was his ability to believe. I wrote it this way: Faithman's power, Abraham's power, is the ability to believe what God says and respond with obedience and worship. You see, that's what's really going on here in these 4 stories. There's some times when God speaks and Abraham believes it. There's some times when he hasn't heard God speak, and so he thinks he's on his own and he does his own thing. But most of the time, at least 3 out of these 4 things, he's believing that God is going to come through with his promise. And so he acts on it. He never should have gone down to Egypt in the first place. But the rest of them, he acts on the fact that God is with him. So if that's his superpower, what's his weakness? What's his kryptonite? There's no blank here, but I just want to encourage you to write this down. His weakness is his self-reliance. Anytime he chooses his own path, that path leads to trouble for him and for the other people around him. But when he hears God and follows God, great things happen. When he chooses to do his own thing, to follow his own path, people get hurt. People get wounded. Okay, so we're going to race through these later years. What I want you to do, we're not going to have time to actually read through these things, but I'm going to show you the chapter, and I'm going to give you 1 or 2 words that describe what that chapter is in Abraham's life, okay? So the later years, Genesis 15, write down the word covenant. Covenant. What happens is God comes back to Abram and he says, okay, one more time, we're going to set this thing up, but we're going to sign a document together. Except God's document's a little weird. God says, what I want you to do is I want you to take a whole bunch of animals and cut them in half. And put half of them here and half of them over there. And then what I want you to do is I want you to walk down the middle of them. Because in the ancient world, that's how you signed a treaty. That's how you signed a covenant with someone. You would take one of your animals and one of their animals, you'd cut them in half, and the 2 of you would walk through it together, and you would say, whichever one of us breaks this covenant is the first person to end up like this. Okay, that's what it was all about. We're walking through the animals to prove that we're not afraid to cut one of us up. That's what it was all about. That's this covenant thing. And so God says, okay, cut some animals and then walk through it. And Abram's like, great. That means if I fail my end of this bargain, then something's messed up, right? I'm going to get wounded. Abram finishes cutting the animals, setting them up, and guess what happens? A flame appears out of nowhere and passes through those animals all by itself. And God says, if I fail this covenant, then it's as if I'm dead. God is just completely one-sided promising Abraham so many great things here. It's amazing. Next, Genesis 16 and 21. Abraham repeats story number 2 from above. He comes up with this creative idea. God told me I'm going to have a son, so since my wife is barren, I need to sleep with a different woman. That's his plan. And so he finds another lady. Actually, it's his wife's servant, and he kind of marries her. She becomes a concubine. He has a child with her. That child gets growing. He's named Ishmael. He grows up. And then eventually, when God's promise of Isaac actually comes true, and Sarah herself has a child, then Abram does this same thing again. He says, okay, creative idea. Let's send away the one we didn't like. And so he sends Ishmael off into the desert. So Abram repeats in chapter 16 and 21, he repeats the whole story of coming up with a really good idea that ends up hurting other people. In Genesis 17, he repeats story number 1. God says to him, here's the deal. I want you to be circumcised, and I want you to circumcise all the guys in your household. And he does it. Okay, so there you go. He heard God, and he obeyed without question. I might have asked some questions. Genesis 18. The next one, Abram repeats. By this point, he's called Abraham, so I'll just start using that. Abraham repeats number 3, which means he finds great success through doing something sacrificial. That's when God says, I'm going to destroy Sodom, and Abraham says, okay, God, let's talk about it. And he begins to pray and pray and pray and pray until finally God says, if I find 10 people there who are good, I'll spare the city. So Abraham finds success, and his son, his nephew Lot gets spared as well. Genesis chapter 20, Abraham repeats number 2 from the top. That's the Abimelech thing, where he says that his wife is his sister, and the king takes the wife to be his wife, and lots of bad stuff happens again. And then the crazy thing is, his son Isaac does the same thing later on. It's messed up, dysfunctional. Flip the page over, and I'm going to take you to one last chapter. It's chapter 22. Many of you know this story, you've heard about this story, but maybe you don't know all the details of it. I'll read a few bits. Sometime later, this is after his son from Sarah has been born named Isaac. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." Early the next morning, Abraham got up, saddled his donkey, and took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. This is just absolutely crazy. Unbelievable to me that God would ever ask a person to do such a thing. But he does. And what's more unbelievable to me is that Abraham sets his clock earlier to wake up extra early the next day so that he can get a head start on doing this thing God has asked him to do. No questions. I'm just going to do it. This is the same guy who has the faith that when God says, "I'm going to bless you," he's going to believe it, and God credits to him as righteousness. So God had said to him, "Abraham, I'm going to give you the son Isaac, and through him, all the nations on earth are going to be blessed." God said that. And now God says, "Sacrifice him." So is Abraham going to be able to believe God? Is it possible for him to believe that God is going to use Isaac to bless the whole world if he's also supposed to kill Isaac? This is where faith comes in. This is more faith than it is obedience. And if you're in one of the life groups this week that's discussing our sermons in more depth, that's what you're going to be talking about this week. You're going to look up Hebrews chapter 11, and you're going to see this story from a different perspective. But here's the deal. Is it possible for Abraham to be a man of faith in the promises of God when God has said something like this? Well, yes. He doesn't know how it's going to work out, but he knows one thing. God told me Isaac was the one. Therefore, if I'm supposed to kill him, something miraculous must happen. So he's willing to walk through this journey. He goes. And then we pick up the story later on